I wasn't invited to the family trip because they were meeting my ex and his new wife. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and 2 years ago, I got divorced. It wasn't messy or dramatic. Just the end of something that had slowly stopped working. We had been together since college, 7 years of marriage that began with so much promise but ended with quiet conversations across our dining table about how we'd both changed. No screaming matches, no betrayals that made for interesting stories. Just two people who had grown in different directions until the space between us was too wide to reach across. We didn't have kids, we didn't fight over property, and we didn't stay in touch after it was over. We had both agreed without needing to say much that our paths would split cleanly. I changed jobs, moved into a small apartment across the city, and started seeing a therapist. The apartment was half the size of our old place, but it felt right: white walls I could paint any color I wanted, windows that let in morning light that stretched across wooden floors, and silence that belonged entirely to me. I filled it slowly with plants, books I'd always meant to read, and a comfortable couch where I could curl up without worrying about taking up too much space. I didn't talk much with my extended family after the divorce, but I kept loose contact mostly through the group chat that buzzed now and then with birthday reminders and forwarded memes. My father and brother had always liked my ex-husband. They got along well, too well sometimes. I remember the fishing trips they took together where I wasn't invited, the football games they watched while I worked in another room, the inside jokes that turned me into an audience rather than a participant. Even during our marriage, I remember them meeting up with him for lunch without telling me or messaging him separately on holidays. Once I found my brother had been helping my ex research anniversary gifts for me, giving advice on what I might like. At the time, I thought it was sweet they were bonding. Now I wonder if they ever talked about me when I wasn't around, if they compared notes about my habits, my sensitivities, the things that made me difficult to live with. Still, I figured that once we split, that chapter closed for everyone. I never asked them to cut ties, but I assumed they'd let things fade out naturally. A few weeks before summer started, I was on a call with one of my cousins. Nothing serious, just catching up while I walked home from work. Out of nowhere, she mentioned how excited she was for the big lake trip this year. She called it a huge deal and joked about needing to borrow a swimsuit. I laughed along, thinking maybe it was something being planned by the younger cousins or a last-minute weekend trip. I didn't ask too many questions. But then over the next few days, I noticed something odd in the family group chat. Photos of packed suitcases, countdown begins texts. Someone posted a meme about long road trips with family. It wasn't loud or direct, but something was clearly being organized, and I hadn't been asked. Out of curiosity, I texted my brother and asked what was going on. He replied with something vague, said it was just a low-key cousins thing, and not everyone was coming. That didn't feel true, but I didn't push. I sent a message to my father the next day and asked if he knew about it. He replied that it was nothing big, just a weekend at the lake with a few people and not a formal family event. A week later, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break and saw a post from another cousin. It was a group photo taken at a lakeside cabin. Everyone was there. My father, my brother, 2 of my aunts, 3 cousins with their kids. And right there, standing in the middle of the photo, my ex-husband smiling with his arm around a woman I had never seen before. A woman I quickly realized was his new wife. I stared at the photo for a long time, not just because he was there, but because it looked like he belonged there, like he was family, like I never existed. I messaged my brother and asked directly why no one told me he'd be there. He replied quickly, said it would have been too uncomfortable if we were both there and that it was easier this way. No apology. No heads up. Just a clean decision made without me about me. They hadn't just failed to invite me. They had excluded me on purpose to make room for him. Not one person warned me. Not one person checked in. Not one person thought I might deserve to know. It wasn't about the trip. It was the message underneath it that they were willing to welcome him back fully and publicly while pretending I'd simply faded out of the picture. I didn't need to argue or explain. The photo said enough. I didn't reply to my brother after that. I closed the app and went back to work like nothing happened, but the truth was already out. My family had gone out of their way to avoid discomfort, not theirs, but mine. And in doing that, they made something else very clear. His return required my absence. I spent those next 2 days working late, going for long walks, and keeping my phone face down. Then, when I felt clear enough, I sent a message to my father. It was simple. I asked when the family started speaking to my ex-husband again. He replied they ran into each other at a funeral 6 months ago for a distant family friend I hadn't attended because I was out of town for work. He said it was casual, that they just talked for a bit and decided to keep in touch after that. I asked if my brother had been there too. He said yes. I asked if anyone else in the family had known. He said it wasn't a secret, but it also wasn't important. I told him it was important to me, that it felt like something I should have known. He responded by saying that I was overreacting and that my ex husband hadn't done anything to deserve being cut off, that people in the family still cared about him and didn't see a reason to turn him away. I messaged the cousin who had posted the lakeside group photo. I asked who had planned the trip. She answered quickly, said it was mostly organized by my father and brother, and that they wanted to keep things as simple as possible. That's why I wasn't told. She added that it wasn't meant to hurt anyone. It was just easier that way. I didn't reply. I left the group chat instead. No message. No explanation. Just gone. Later that night, my brother texted me. He accused me of stirring things up by leaving the chat and making people feel guilty, said I was twisting everything and making it all about me. I only replied once. I said, the drama isn't my reaction. It's the fact that no one said anything while planning around me. The next morning, I got a message from my aunt. She told me I needed to see the bigger picture, that families evolve, that people come and go, that it's better to avoid tension when you can. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I felt. She just wanted me to understand their decision. By that point, it was already clear what had happened. No one had slipped up. No one forgot to tell me. They made a choice from the beginning. And when they saw that choice hurt me, they focused more on defending it than on making it right. I deleted the group chat from my phone. Not just left it, removed the entire thread. Then I started putting together a private timeline. I went through old photos on social media, backed up messages, and group emails. I marked down every event where my ex-husband could have been included without my knowledge. I found a few birthdays, a holiday dinner I skipped last year because of a work deadline, a cousin's engagement party I hadn't been able to attend. As I looked through it all, I realized the trip wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time they stopped pretending. They had been rebuilding a version of the family that didn't include me for months. Quietly, slowly, and every time I didn't show up somewhere, it just made their job easier. No one had warned me. No one had checked in. They had all acted like I was someone they didn't need to consider anymore. I met with my mother for dinner later that week at a quiet diner she likes. The conversation started simple, but eventually turned to the past. She brought up something I hadn't thought about in a long time. How my father always seemed to side with my ex during family disagreements. How he'd laugh at his jokes, back him in arguments, even when the topic was something about me. My mother said it always felt like my father and brother were more emotionally invested in him than in their relationship with me. A few days later, I bumped into an old coworker during lunch who mentioned she had run into my ex-husband at an event a few months ago. Apparently, he had remarried 4 months back. I hadn't known. No one had mentioned anything. The family clearly did. They had not only invited him to the trip, but invited his new wife too. This wasn't a last-minute thing. This was something planned. I sent one last message to my brother. It was short. I asked him if he had invited my ex-husband himself. He replied, "We just wanted things to be peaceful. That's all." I didn't answer after that. I opened my contacts, deleted his number, and did the same for my father. I didn't block them. I just removed the option for casual connection. No more random texts. No more birthdays or holiday greetings. No more pretending like things were normal. The next day, I booked a session with my therapist. I hadn't gone in a while, but I needed to talk to someone without judgment. Her office was the same as always, soft lighting, comfortable chair, the slight scent of lavender in the air. I'd been coming here since just after the divorce, when I could barely articulate what I was feeling beyond a vague sense of failure. Now, 2 years later, I sat across from her calmly describing betrayal with clinical precision. "It feels like I've been erased," I told her, hands folded neatly in my lap, voice steadier than I expected. "Not just forgotten. Deliberately removed." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Family systems often resist change," she said. "Sometimes they'll work to preserve what feels familiar, even when the circumstances have changed dramatically." "By keeping him and discarding me?" I asked. "By preserving the relationships they valued, perhaps without realizing the cost to you," she suggested. "Not that it excuses their actions." We talked about how long this had likely been happening, how I had assumed they'd move on from my ex-husband when we divorced. But instead, they kept him and slowly phased me out, not in one big moment. In small quiet decisions. We discussed how family betrayal cuts deeper than most because it challenges our fundamental sense of belonging. "What do you want to happen now?" she asked toward the end of our session. I didn't have to think long. "I don't want reconciliation," I said. "I want clarity. I want to stop hoping for explanations that won't change anything." She smiled slightly. "That's different from where you were 6 months ago." "Yes," I agreed. I think I needed to see it this clearly to finally let it go. That night, I went through photos my family had shared over the past year. My ex-husband was in more of them than I expected, in the background of a cousin's birthday party, sitting at the edge of the table during a holiday dinner, even one from a baby shower I hadn't been able to attend. I had been slowly erased from events I wasn't invited to, while he had been slowly invited back into all of them. They had made him part of the new normal, and no one said a word to me. I didn't confront anyone else after that. There was no point. I didn't want apologies. I didn't need explanations. I just started writing down new boundaries, not out of spite, but because I finally saw what ignoring the signs had cost me. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down what I would and wouldn't accept going forward. No more pretending relationships were intact when they weren't. No more overlooking small betrayals to keep the peace. No more assuming silence meant nothing was happening behind my back. No more making myself small to make room for people who wouldn't make room for me. It wasn't a manifesto or declaration. It was a private promise to myself, a guideline for the person I wanted to become. Someone who valued honesty over harmony. Someone who wouldn't build a life on shifting ground. I spent the rest of that day methodically disentangling myself from the web of connections that no longer served me. I backed up my old photos to a hard drive, sorting through memories with surprisingly little emotion. I unsubscribed from family email chains that had once dictated my holiday plans and social calendar. I cleared out recurring reminders for birthdays and anniversaries, realizing how much mental space I'd reserved for people who had reserved none for me. With each digital tie I severed, I felt lighter. It wasn't about punishing them or making a statement they'd never see. It was about protecting whatever was left of my peace. It was about stopping the habit of checking in on lives that had continued without me. It was about accepting that some doors had closed, and instead of knocking louder, I needed to walk away and find doors that would open at my approach. A few days after I stopped all contact with my father and brother, I got a message from my aunt. She hadn't known how to reach out earlier, but she needed to say something. She'd been at the lake cabin but didn't stay long. She said the moment she saw my ex-husband walk in with his new wife, it felt wrong. Not just that he was there, but the way everyone acted like it was normal. She told me about a dinner they had the first night. My ex-husband stood up during a toast and said he was back where he belongs. Everyone laughed. My brother raised his glass. His new wife followed it up with a joke about being an upgrade, and no one said anything. Not one person shut it down. My aunt said she stayed quiet too, and that's why she reached out now, because she regretted not speaking up. That same night, I searched through photos from the trip. One picture stopped me cold. In the background behind the group was a large white banner tied between two trees. In bold red letters, it read, "Welcome back." And underneath, their names, both of them. It wasn't just a trip. It was a welcome party. I looked closer at the photo and noticed my childhood cat curled up at his feet. The one I had left with my father when I moved after the divorce because my apartment didn't allow pets. The next morning, I drove to my father's house. I didn't call ahead. I rang the bell, and when he opened the door, I didn't say a word. The cat came running out, and I picked her up. I walked straight back to the car. He didn't say anything or try to stop me. That night, my brother sent one final message. "You've made your choice. We'll live with ours." I read it once, then deleted it. Deleted his number from my contacts and cleaned out any shared threads. I updated my contact list to include only people who had shown they respected me. Later, I opened my photo archive and saw a pattern. In photo after photo, there he was. My ex-husband, posing with cousins, sitting next to my aunt at a backyard barbecue, helping cut a birthday cake at my niece's party. I had thought those events were mine, that I had simply missed them because of work or distance, but he had been there all along. This wasn't about forgiveness or second chances. This was about replacement. I found a screenshot from a holiday Zoom call last year. I hadn't joined that year. I had said I was feeling sick. In the screenshot, I counted the faces on the screen. 12 boxes. My ex-husband was one of them. Smiling, holding a mug, surrounded by familiar faces. Not a single person had thought it was strange. Not one had asked me if I'd be okay with it. They hadn't warned me. They hadn't even mentioned it afterward. I stopped scrolling after that. It wasn't about catching them in lies. It wasn't about who invited who first or how long ago it all started. It was about the truth behind every decision. They didn't forget me. They didn't avoid me out of fear. They just stopped seeing me as someone who mattered in the room. A week later, a childhood friend called. Her mother had attended the lake trip through one of my cousins. She told me my brother had been talking about why I wasn't invited and that he told people I had emotionally neglected my ex-husband during our marriage, that the family had to choose a side and it was easier to pick his. Those words weren't said in anger. They were calm, casual, as if the decision was based on something they'd all agreed on a long time ago. It wasn't just exclusion. It was rewriting, quiet, steady rewriting of who I was and what happened. I spent that weekend going through my old texts and emails. I found reminders I had set for my ex-husband's doctor appointments, screenshots of birthday plans I had coordinated, even copies of loan payment receipts I had helped cover when he was switching jobs. I printed out a few things and stacked them into a folder. Not to use them. Just to see them in front of me, so I knew the story they were telling about me wasn't the truth. Later, my friend messaged again. Another family trip was already being planned, this time at a beach rental in a different state. Same group. No mention of me. They were calling it the new family tradition. This wasn't a one-time replacement. It was a restructuring. At my next therapy session, my therapist pointed out something I hadn't put into words yet. The real cut hadn't started with the lake trip. It had started much earlier. In the choices they made slowly over time, I just hadn't noticed when the quiet started turning into distance. That weekend, I hosted a dinner. Just 4 people, my mother, my godmother, my aunt, and me. Nothing fancy. Homemade pasta, a bottle of wine, and some old music playing in the background. It wasn't a party or event session. It was just the people who had stayed respectful, sitting in the same room for a night. My aunt shared something unexpected. She said her husband was one of the people who argued against inviting me to the lake trip. He had called it a stability risk. That having both me and my ex-husband there would upset the dynamic. I didn't argue. I just nodded and said, stability isn't peace if it's built on cutting people out. When the night ended, my mother handed me a small box. Inside were birthday cards from when I was a kid, old school photos, even a drawing I made in 2nd grade that she had kept for decades. Nothing in the box had anything to do with the current mess. It was all from before any of this had happened, before family became something political. I thanked her, took the box home, and placed it in my closet. That dinner didn't fix anything. It wasn't closure. It wasn't healing, but it was real, and it was quiet. And sometimes that's enough to see things clearly. I wasn't going to chase explanations anymore. I wasn't going to respond to what they were still telling people. From that point on, I decided I wouldn't look back at anything that didn't choose me in return. I wasn't going to defend myself to people who had already chosen to misunderstand me. 2 weeks later, I found out my family was planning another trip to celebrate the 1-year wedding anniversary of my ex-husband and his new wife. That was when I realized this wasn't just about inclusion. It was a shift in the family narrative. The trip wasn't about the couple. It was about turning their story into the family story, and I wasn't part of it. I had been edited out of the timeline. I made a new rule for myself. No more emotional explanations to people who already decided not to understand me. I wouldn't explain why I wasn't coming to things. I wouldn't respond to passive messages. Instead, I opened my browser and started planning something new. I booked a solo hiking trip for the end of the month, somewhere I had never been, somewhere with no shared memories. This wasn't about escape. It was about building something that didn't require anyone else's approval, a space where I didn't have to explain myself. The past didn't end in a dramatic moment. It ended in silence. It ended when I stopped waiting for someone to fix what they were never sorry for. It ended the moment I stopped needing to be understood by people who had already replaced me without hesitation. 2 weeks after I started planning the hiking trip, I was called into a meeting with Human Resources at work. They'd received an anonymous complaint accusing me of harassment linked to a domestic situation. The report was vague and didn't match my record. HR had no intention of taking action but wanted me to be aware. That night, I changed every password, turned on 2-factor authentication, and removed my name from old public groups. A week later, at a small bookstore downtown, I ran into my ex-husband. We both froze. He gave a small nod. I nodded back. He took a step closer and quietly said he hadn't expected things to turn out the way they did. I didn't ask what he meant. I just said, "That's the problem." They did. He admitted he never thought the family would bring him back in so quickly. I told him that's their pattern, not mine. We both turned away. That was the last time I saw him. I went to the storage closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in months. Inside were cards, old family letters, a few framed photos from holidays long before the divorce. I took out only the ones that still meant something. Everything else went into a new box labeled archive. Then I went through my phone's gallery and deleted all the screenshots of the family gatherings, the social media posts, the tagged photos of my ex-husband at events I hadn't known about. One by one, they disappeared. They weren't proof anymore. They weren't warnings. They were just digital weight I didn't need to carry. That night, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and the cat asleep at my feet. The house was quiet. For the first time since this all began, there was no story left to unravel. It had never been just about being included or excluded. It was about something deeper. The story of who I had been, twisted and replaced until it no longer belonged to me. A few days before my hiking trip, I got a message from my aunt who had been at the lake house. She said she wasn't going to attend any more family events. She called it what it was, replacing me. She said watching them pretend it was normal made her realize that staying silent made her part of it. I invited her, my mother, and 2 old friends to my place for dinner. There was no theme, no occasion, just 4 people who had stuck with me. We didn't talk about the trip. We didn't talk about my ex-husband. We talked about a movie we all hated in high school, about how my friend's car broke down in the middle of nowhere, about the time my aunt got kicked out of a concert for bringing a chair. And for the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel heavy. At one point, one of my friends asked if I'd ever just wanted to disappear for a bit. No planning, no screens, just mountains and trees. I said yes. By the end of the night, we had booked a cabin 2 hours north. When we got there, everything felt still. There was no phone signal, no news, no family group threads, no memories attached to any room, just hiking trails, scrambled eggs in the morning, and the sound of someone failing miserably to start a fire. Before we started the drive home, I sent one last message to my father and brother. This chapter is closed. Don't reach out again. Then I blocked both numbers. For good. It was over. Back at the cabin, I stood on the porch with my coffee and watched the sun dip behind the trees. There was no music playing. No one was talking. It was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not because it was far from people, but because nothing in that moment needed me to perform. No version of me had to be accepted. There was just me. 6 months passed quietly. I found a new job at a small publishing house where no one knew my history or asked about the gap in my resume. I relocated to an apartment on the opposite end of the city, a 3rd-floor walk-up with large windows and a tiny balcony where I could sit with morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. The first night there, I realized no one in my family knew where I lived. No one could drop by unannounced. No one could claim my space without invitation. The thought was both lonely and liberating. I started gardening on that small balcony, herbs at first, then flowers, then vegetables in carefully arranged containers. I tracked their growth in a journal, noting which plants thrived in which positions, which needed more water, which were stubborn enough to push through unexpected frosts. There was something calming about tending to living things that asked for nothing beyond basic care. I also started a cooking group that met every other weekend. It began with a flyer I posted at a local bookstore: learn to cook together, no experience necessary. 6 people showed up to the first meeting. We made a simple pasta dish and drank too much wine. By the 3rd meeting, we had a regular group of 8 who traded off hosting duties. We tackled increasingly complicated recipes, celebrated our successes, and laughed through our failures. Eventually, one of the attendees, a neighbor I'd spoken to in passing, started showing up early to help set up and stayed late to wash dishes. He was quiet but attentive, with a dry sense of humor that emerged slowly over time. He remembered how I took my coffee and which cooking tools I found frustrating to use. At first, it was just casual, then it wasn't. We started meeting outside the cooking group, first for coffee, then for walks through the neighborhood, then for dinners that stretched late into the evening with conversation. He told me about his work restoring old buildings, about the grandfather who had taught him to use tools, about the year he spent traveling after college before settling into a career. I told him about my love of mystery novels, my collection of vintage postcards, my dream of someday writing a children's book. Nothing about the connection felt rushed. There were no ghost stories between us, no comparisons to people who had come before, no history trying to sneak into the present. We were building something new, brick by careful brick, without the shadows of old relationships hanging over us. He never asked about my family, sensing it was a closed topic, and I appreciated his understanding without explanation. One evening at a street food market, I saw my ex-husband, his wife, and 2 of my cousins laughing near a vendor. They didn't see me. I didn't try to be seen. I walked right past them and kept going. There was no rush of anger. No freeze in my chest. Just distance. Like spotting a photo of a place you once visited and realizing you have no reason to ever go back. That night, I sat down at my desk and opened a brand new journal, leather-bound with crisp, blank pages, a gift to myself I'd been saving for the right moment. The lamp cast a warm circle of light as I uncapped my favorite pen. On the first page, I wrote one line in clean, steady handwriting. I am not what they left behind. I am what I chose next. I looked at the words for a long time, feeling their weight, their promise, their permission to move forward without looking back. They weren't a rejection of the past, the good memories remained mine to keep. They weren't a declaration of war against those who had hurt me, they deserved neither my anger nor my energy. They were simply a quiet acknowledgement that the narrative had changed, and I was now its author. I thought about all the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we belong. How sometimes those stories get written by other people, imposed on us until we mistake them for truth. How liberation comes not from convincing others to change the story, but from realizing we can write our own. I thought about my mother, who had stayed when others left. My aunt, who had found her courage late but sincerely. My new friends, who knew me only as I was now, not as who I had been or who others claimed I was. I thought about the man from the cooking class, whose interest in me was simple and straightforward, uncomplicated by histories I hadn't lived with him. I thought about the hiking trip, about standing on that cabin porch with nothing but forest around me, about how small and insignificant family politics had seemed against that backdrop. How the world was wide enough to build a life far beyond the narrow boundaries of what I had lost. Then I closed the book. Not to forget. Just because the story was no longer about them. It was about me, about the quiet strength I'd found in leaving behind what wasn't meant for me, about the future I was creating one choice at a time, about the woman who had walked through fire and emerged not unburned, but unbroken. I placed the journal in my desk drawer where I could return to it whenever I needed reminding of how far I'd come. Then I turned off the lamp and went to the window, looking out at the city lights, at all the lives being lived in parallel to mine, at all the stories unfolding in apartments and houses and streets I would never know. There was comfort in that vastness, in being both insignificant and infinite at the same time. Tomorrow would be ordinary: coffee, work, maybe a call with my mother, perhaps a text from the cooking class man. But it would be mine, built from choices I had made, filled with people who saw me clearly. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.